Welcome to Seat at the Table, where we believe your technical skills will get you in the room, but your soft skills and business acumen will earn you a seat. My name is Jerich Beason, and I have the good fortune of being your host. We're having conversations with leaders in different verticals with different backgrounds about different topics so that we can extract their hard earned wisdom in short form conversations like the one we're having today. Today's conversation is with Jason Rebholz. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Excited, man. This is we were trying to make this happen for a little while now, so I'm excited to make this happen. I know that this is going to be a conversation that's going to really add value to the community. Maybe you can share a little bit of your background and why you are the right person for this conversation.
Yeah, so I've had a fun background just getting into security. It really started when I was in high school, just learning to program, and I quickly realized just I did not want to do programming. And so I started just looking around and talking to my teacher, and he introduced me this idea of computer networking. And through that, I found computer security and just fell in love with it. And so I ended up going to school for at that time they didn't have degrees in cybersecurity, so it was computer networking and system administration with a focus on security. And just by sheer dumb luck, I found an opportunity at Mandiant. And at that time, they were just starting to look for college hires. I didn't even know what incident response was, but I applied for a job that I wasn't qualified for. But because they were just started looking for college hires, they reached out. And I was one of the first college hires that they had. And so I showed up day one, not knowing what forensics was, thinking I was going to be going to do pen testing. And they handed me a hard drive and said, "Here you go. Tell us everything that happened." And I was like, okay, well, we got to figure out how to do that. And so thankfully, I was very, very fortunate to be at a time when there was a lot of really good talent at Mandiant, and I was sitting in the same room as them. And so I was just a sponge and soaked up as much information as I can. And that really started my career off in incident response. I did investigations into nation state threats, to hacktivists, but I spent a lot of my time on cybercrime. So at that time, it was all when the retailer breaches were happening, where hackers were breaking into companies, putting malware on point of sale systems and stealing credit card information. And so I absolutely loved those types of investigations and just ate those up. And so I was there for quite some time. And then as it grew, Mandy got acquired by FireEye, and I wanted to get back to a smaller company. And so I went to a startup doing incident response again and built that company out. And so that's where I started learning more of the business acumen, learning, how do you really run an organization, because I was building out their professional services team. So recruiting, hiring people in, getting them trained up, working with customers, and just really just learning how to lead is really kind of the key thing there. From there, I was just lived in the startup world. I did some time where I did partnerships and business development, something completely non-technical. But ultimately, then went and started a company where we were focused on business recovery. So when somebody got hit with ransomware, we would bring people in, get them back up and running. So I learned more on the resilience side. How do you avoid the catastrophic events that happen? And ultimately, after doing that for about 12 years, I was like, you know what? I think I'm done with incident response. Like I need to step back from the crisis mode. And the one thing I never really did was work in industry. And so that's when I really set my sights out on getting a CISO role. And I knew myself well enough that if I was just focused on only internal security, I knew that I was going to be too bored. And so I'm just a little bit neurotic, whereas like I need to have multiple jobs in one single paycheck. But I found a really kind of cool niche at Corvus Insurance where I would do the internal security, but I also was building out a threat intel team to help our underwriters understand where are threats going. How can we try to get ahead of trends in attacks so that we can stem them from happening. And then also was focused on building out these virtual CISO offerings, if you will, for our policyholders. So more just how can we provide more support for our policyholders and our underwriters where they have access to experts, cybersecurity experts, so that they can answer their questions. How do you deploy MFA? How do you, secure your backups, those sort of things. And so that's given me a really kind of fun experience where I can build out an internal security program. But, for me, what was really cool was I can also think about security for tens of thousands of companies. So not only how can I keep my company secure, but also tens and thousands of our policyholders as well.
This is the most thorough introduction we've gotten in the past, and I got to tell you, I don't typically do this, but I'm about to pivot from my planned script and questions I want to ask because you've sparked so many different things, and I've been working on this active listening, so I didn't write down all my things, so I may miss some of the stuff I want to talk about. But first, I think you may be the only other CISO that I've met similar to myself where you started your career in cybersecurity,
Mm.
right? And so I like to tell people, like, I'm one of the first, but I won't be the last. I think there's going to be a whole line of people. I just happen to start at a time that made sense from that perspective. I worked for the government. I was introduced to Mandiant back then. When you were introduced to Mandiant, it was not a good thing. It was because you came parachuting in with a 24-hour notice. But I learned immensely from what the Mandiant team was doing. I learned about IOCs and TTPs in a way that I never would have known. And I was working for some pretty large organizations, and we were completely mind blown by the work that Mandiant was doing. So the foundation that you have, it's impressive. It's really contradictory to the topic we're going to talk about today, which probably sounds really bland and boring, which is compliance. So I'm really going to be interested in seeing how we take this uber technical, deeply, cybersecurity focused experience and background and talk about compliance. But we're gonna try. And I think you always hear this topic, compliance does not equal security. I think everybody says it. It's almost like a tagline, and I think there's a lot of truth to it, but there are also some misnomers in that statement. And so I guess my first question to you is, how do you navigate this really complex landscape of compliance requirements, which I know you're experiencing in the insurance industry, while still making sure that you actually do security well?
Yeah, it's a really interesting balance. And I will tell you, and I'm glad you called this out. My views on compliance before switching into internal security were very different than what they are now, right? Uh,
Yep.
and I think I was, very much so in that camp of, compliance is not equal security. But, I was probably the one on the megaphones, screaming that. Uh, and I think what I've realized over time, especially just owning a program and looking at it, and as you said, in the insurance space, like you have more regulations. Not to the degree that say banking does, right? But it's enough to kind of see, very clearly what are the things you have to do, and what people care about. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you care about that or not. If a
Mm,
regulator does, it's important. And so, what I realized is that for people who haven't grown up in attacks, right? And this is why I love the fact that you grew up in cybersecurity as well. And I think we could probably derail this conversation on that alone. But
yeah.
I think I've always taken for granted, like I know how attacks work. I know the things that actually matter, right? And at least in my
Mm,
mind. And so if I'm looking at compliance where it's telling me to secure a printer, or don't allow USB device to be plugged in, I'm like, yeah, okay, well, that's like less than 0.1% of the attacks that happen. I want to focus on the most likely threats, and that's not it. But at the end of the day, I still have to comply with those things. And so, what I really like to do is try to figure out, let's get all of these things written out. What are the different compliance requirements that we have? Let's prioritize them based on our risk, and let's figure out, like, what other projects are we working on, like things that really matter, right? Passwordless, right? What can we kind of tick off along the way and say, hey, maybe we're not hitting this by the letter of the law, but is there some other intent that we're meeting kind of indirectly? And so you can get a little bit creative in some sense, where what, like, we might not be hitting something directly on, but we're addressing it in these other ways, and that at least buys some time for us to address that later on. Because let's be realistic, like a lot of times compliance driven requirements are going to be years and years of work, and you're going to hit diminishing returns very, very quickly. And you can't just focus solely on that, because you're missing out on all these other high yield projects that are going to drastically increase your security. And so it's a balance between the two. And I don't have a perfect formula, right? But you got to kind of figure out what works for your company. But,
yeah.
kind of open up the car door and see what you hit on the way down with the projects that you're working on that will hit some of these compliance requirements, so that you are balancing both of the worlds there.
Yeah, I love every aspect of that. And I really am intrigued that you use passwordless. Because passwordless is messing with the brains of our checklist warrior auditors,
Ooh.
right? So when they're like, so how often do you rotate your passwords? We don't. What do you mean you don't rotate your passwords? We don't have them. Right? Like,
It's a whole paradigm shift. Yeah.
and so I'm having conversations with auditors. Hey, that little box with the check that you want to put in it, instead of doing that, think of what you're trying to achieve with that checkbox. What is
Exactly.
the outcome? You're trying to protect the account. Well, hey, we're doing it 10 other ways that happen to be 10 years ahead of what your actual requirement has. I use the example of compliance says you must have antivirus,
Mhm.
right? And so what I have been doing to achieve security while still checking the compliance box is saying, what is the objective?
Mhm.
How do I achieve that objective in the most modern way that addresses the more modern threats so that I can still say I met that compliance? So, yes, I have EDR. Because I have EDR, I have antivirus. Check.
Exactly.
But if I let the auditors drive me and their audit report says Jerich's company does not have antivirus, well, then my company's going to say, well, go find the cheapest antivirus. And now we're not going to address the threat, but we've checked the box.
Mhm.
Um, so
Yeah.
using your example that you shared, I'm curious, you talked about before you worked for industry, you thought of compliance a different way. I'm going to imagine that a lot of the companies you looked at, they were all compliant, but they were still breached. Is that kind of how you shape that mindset?
100%. And it's specifically with my experience with organized crime in retailers.
Yep.
Every company that I went into to do an investigation was PCI compliant. And yet every single one of them still had an incident, right? And this, I think, is it's you kind of have to shift the mindset as well, in the terms of like the goal is not to prevent all the incidents, is to prevent
Mm,
a debilitating attack, a material impact on the company, keep them operational while going through it, right? And so, in the terms of credit card, right? All right, great. Maybe the goal here is not to keep them out of the environment because that's very, very difficult, but let's adopt some new technologies, right? Like I saw this firsthand when we had point-to-point encryption coming out in PCI, and tokenization. If I can't even see the credit card data, well, either can the attacker. So let's just like fix the actual root problem that I've got, credit card data flowing through my environment, or I'm storing clear text credit card data. And it just goes back to what you're talking about, right? And I love this, and I'm going to steal this from you, right? But it's outcome driven security, right? If you're focused, and this is a compliance mindset, it's checklist driven, right? And that's good for people who don't know where to start, right? And I think
mm,
that's the best part of a compliance driven. If you don't know where to start, it's a very good point. But you have to understand the outcome that you're working towards. And I think this is true in security. I think it's true in business. Like we get so focused on the list of things that we're supposed to do because somebody told us to do it that
mm.
we forget what is the actual problem we're trying to solve here. And like you have to start with defining the problem and then find the solution to it. And you'll find that some of the compliance things that you have to do are going to be part of that. But your analogy with or example with AV is perfect, right? Like I'm not going to invest in AV. I'm going to invest in, an EDR solution that's going to give me AV plus a whole bunch of other really important things that are going to hit a lot of other compliance requirements anyway. And so I think it's just that like natural discussion that has to happen with auditors to kind of get them to think of like, because you got to kind of put them in your mindset and like help them understand how are you viewing security in your environment. And sometimes you're viewing it wrong, right? So let's just throw the ego at the door, right? But like a lot of times there is a really good perspective there, that is drawn there. Like let's just skip to EDR because it's going to be good. We don't need to focus on buying an antiquated AV.
Spot on, spot on. So there's another phrase we all use: security enables the business, right? I think that looks different in the B2C world than it does in the B2B world. But B2B is where you operate, and B2B means you have to convince other organizations that you're doing security well. And one of the ways that you do that is through that compliance checkbox, right?
Mhm.
So, how do you manage the fact that your business and your sales teams need you to be able to say yes on this compliance checklist while you know the resources need to go over here to keep you out of the newspaper?
Yeah, and I think this is where certain companies, it's like product companies, right? If they are part of the sales process, It's a bit of a blessing in disguise. It can feel painful at times, especially when it's, certain customers are going to ask some just really weird questions that have nothing to do with real security. But I think it's a similar mindset there, right? And like you can kind of try to skip the line and go get your SOC 2 whatever, right? And just try to get to the point where people are going to ask fewer questions. But like get this, do what you have to do to get the customers in a good spot, right? And that's going to be important. But when you're in a position there where you're trying to show to a customer that like you're taking security seriously, right? And I think this is going to be more true for discussions you're having with larger companies. You want to go in and say, yeah, we got our SOC 2, but here's what we're really doing from a security perspective, right? Like, here's how we're securing our pipeline. Here's how we're implementing, zero trust, whatever. I mean, like, forget about the buzzwords, right? But like, what are you actually doing with security beyond just what like is on the little plaque that you're going to give out to your customers there?
Nah, spot on. I think that's really what it's about. To your point, the larger customers, you're going to take a time. You're going to sit and talk with the CISO. You're having a conversation with the CISO like this. We're saying the same thing, dude. You have some. I'm not going to name a event. I'm not going to name a tool, dude. You have antivirus. Like, what are you doing? Like, I don't care that gave you your ISO or your PCI. I can't trust the CISO that makes a decision to get antivirus over EDR because now I question every other decision you've made, right? And so that kind of thing happens when you get the CISO to CISO conversation. But to your point, sometimes we don't get to have a voiceover, and so
Yeah.
we have to be able to show that we have that, that logo that says we've been validated and verified by somebody.
Yeah, and for most people, I mean, there's a whole other conversation here on third-party risk management and how broken that is, right? But like, there's something there where like you're not gonna. I think for all companies, right? You just have to recognize that you're not going to get a good feel of somebody's security program from a questionnaire or even some plaque that they have in their office, right? To your point, like the conversations that you and I would have directly, right, where we're talking about our security program. And, let's pretend that nobody's listening right now, but like we're honest with each other because we understand like security is not about perfection. It's
Right.
about just like making sure that you're doing something in a resilient way that you're going to stave off the most likely attacks and that you're building the environment in such a way where it can withstand a ransomware attack or whatever it might be, whatever your threat model is. That's the stuff that we want to talk about. And, I would learn more in a conversation with you on how are you thinking about passwordless? Like, how are you trying to think about deploying that? What are the challenges that you're having, right? Like, you can spot it a mile away when somebody hasn't been in the trenches doing the type of work to really build out the security program. And those are typically the conversations where here's the list of tools that we have. Great. How do you use them? Right. And that was like the first lesson I learned as a CISO, right? Like, it's easy to buy a tool. Where it's really difficult is implementing that in your everyday workflow. So I want to know about that. Like, how are you using the technology day in and day out and, holding your team accountable and really driving progress forward that way versus just the list of controls and, security tech that you've put into your systems.
Yeah, this makes me want to move this into a whole cyber insurance conversation because cyber insurance questionnaires. But
Oh, yeah.
we'll make that a future episode. We got to bring you back for a future conversation on cyber insurance. I'm pretty sure everybody would want to have that talk. But let's talk politics, right? So there's organizational politics. How do you navigate the political challenges when they're going to impact cybersecurity, but they also impact job security at the same time? How do you manage that?
So I think part of it is you have to recognize first, like, as a CISO, your job is more human based than tech based.
Hmm.
You have to build relationships with people, and you also have to recognize that your way of doing things and your timeline is not important to everybody else. And so it's much more about, trying to understand where other people are coming from. And, when we talk about politics, like it's really about if I'm going to have a conversation with 5 different people, there's going to be some common thread of interest in there, right? Let's say, we'll go back to passwordless. I want to deploy passwordless in my environment. I've got to talk to the IT teams. I've got to potentially talk to engineering. I obviously got to talk with my team. I got to talk with the execs, right? Because it's a fundamentally different way of doing authentication, and it's going to impact a lot of different parties. And so everybody is going to have an opinion on it. But at the end of the day, if we can really find what the common thread of interest is between all these groups, like that's what I want to find. And when you can get that, it becomes much easier than just trying to force feed everybody your agenda. Because again, it's my agenda does not matter to engineering. Like
Mm.
they, as much as I would love for engineering to scream security from the mountaintops, it's not realistic. And it would be, it actually, maybe this is controversial. I think it would be weird if that's what they were doing, right?
Yep.
Because I don't think it's right that we should expect the entire company to have security at the first thought that they're doing of every single thing. Because for me, engineering is not the first thought, it's security, because that's my world, right? And so you have to kind of figure out what are the common interests, how can you drive that, and that all comes down to relationships. Like you have to be able to work with others. And I think the other key aspect of this is extend your timeline. It's fascinating to me that, I don't know if this is still accurate or not, with the average tenure of a CISO of being 18 months. Like, and I get why, right? Because it can be frustrating when and this happened to me, right? It's like you come in, you put together this roadmap, and this is especially more shocking for me, having been a consultant for so long, especially in IR, because like when I would go in as a consultant and I would have a list of recommendations, the company were like, okay, we're going to do that, right? Because their house is on fire, so of course they're going to do it. And so I took that mindset with me when I came into industry, and I put together a roadmap. I was like, okay, this is everything we need to do, and the business is like, well, that's a lot of stuff. Do we really need to do all of that? And it was a really, really good experience for me because I had to step back and say, no, we actually don't need to do all of that. And so like it took it from what I wanted to do in maybe say 3 years, and maybe I extended out to 5 years and put it into smaller chunks, because you just can't do a lot in security in a single year. Like you can find a lot of quick wins. Don't get me wrong. And you absolutely should. And like that's the stuff that you can control. And you really need to lean hard into that on the things that you can do where you don't need a lot of permission from other people. But these big boulders, like these big projects that are cross-functional and like are going to take a very long time, maybe you're only working on 1 or 2 of those a year, because that's the amount of time it's going to take to get the right alignment between the businesses. So yeah, it's, the people aspect, and extend your timeline.
Ah, dude, so many sound bites. So first of all, your first starting point of being a CISO is more of a human job than a technical job. It's the premise of the show. It's something that I don't think we lean into heavily enough. And they call them soft skills. I think the new term is now called power skills,
Hmm.
because they're realizing how much the soft skills are actually a way to wield power. And one could argue that power and politics go hand in hand. I look at politics as influence, right? And there's
Exactly.
different ways of influencing. And there's a pretty big following that says leadership is influence, right? And so speaking to people on their level about what matters to them, unless you're one of the, I don't know, 500-600 companies that are converging on RSA in a little while, your business isn't security. Your
Hmm.
business is something else. And you shouldn't expect that to be 100% top of mind. Should there be certain indicators that let them know I need to be a little bit more focused? This email looks a little fishy. Someone's asking for something. Absolutely. But should that be something that's always flowing in their brain? No. And if it is, you're probably not making money, right? So the whole idea is you have a role, they have a role, just as much as you have to make sure that you're following whatever HR policies that are out there. They have security policy you have to follow. But if HR gave you 150 policies to follow, you wouldn't follow 150. So if you're giving your business 150 policies to follow, don't expect them to follow it. Like,
Exactly. Yeah, I think
simple
we
as that.
expect too much, right? And
Yeah.
it's, I don't know. It's because you have this all the time, like security shouldn't be the place of no, and blah blah blah, right? And it's absolutely true. But there's also the other side of this of like we have to push security culture, and I still have yet to find anyone that can really give me a clear definition of what security culture is. And so, we can live in a world of ambiguity there and trying to rely on humans to do the right thing, but that's a little bit naive, right? And so like you need to build your security program where that things are going to fall through the cracks and that people aren't going to read the things that you send them. And so like plan for the failure. And that's the essence of building a resilient program, is that you
Yeah.
have to plan for the inevitable failure.
Challenge accepted. I'm going to attempt to give you my definition of a security culture, and you tell me how far off I am. So first, I believe that culture is a combination of what you celebrate and what you tolerate, and it
Mm,
starts from the top down. So when we start as an organization celebrating good security behavior and holding people accountable for security behavior that's not good, we have a security culture, because people will repeat behaviors that are celebrated, and people will stop doing things that they're held accountable for doing. It, any culture, no matter what it is, a safety culture, we slap you on the wrist if you have safety incidents. We celebrate you if you haven't had incidents in 100 days. I mean, the list goes on and on. And so that's what I consider security culture. And how I do that is I hold my executives accountable for the things that their people should be doing. I don't hold the people accountable. And that way they take the steps to make sure that their people are doing the right things. People can say what they want to say about phishing tests. I can see both sides of the equation, but the reality is it builds muscle memory. It helps prepare them for things. I care more about the reporting than the clicking. But if I have an executive's bonus tied to 25% of his team reporting those phishing tests, guess what? We're going to see a whole lot more people reporting those phishing tests. If any executive is below 10% of their people reporting and they see a 5% dip in their bonus as a result, guess what? We're going to start seeing more people reporting phishing tests, right? And that's how you build a culture. It's deliberate. And that's my take on it.
I love that. And I think the key for me is the accountability part of that. And the only thing I would say though is I do think that there has to be accountability at all levels, but it's different types of accountability, right? To your point, like I subscribe to the same philosophy with phishing tests. I care much more about the reporting than I do whether or not you clicked it, right? I'm assuming you're gonna click on something at some point. I'll be disappointed, right? It's like, the father thing. I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed, right? But if, just like my mom said when I was growing up, it's like, I don't care what you do, but don't lie, right? Just tell me the
Mm,
truth. And that to me is like that's the reporting aspect of it. And so
yeah.
that to me is that's the accountability at every level of the company where, hey, like if you messed up, cool, right? Like it happens. But just give me a heads up because that's how we're going to make a difference here instead of like us trying to look through logs a week after the fact when something bad has happened and then track it back. Like just there's no shame, right? And I think this goes part of the culture too is like it's transparency and trust. Like I'm gonna, trust me to do the things that are gonna give you a little bit of air cover, but I'm also gonna like trusting in you to help us, when something bad happens. Just give us a heads up.
Spot on, man. You made another point around you can only do so much in security per year. I think you can get a lot of things done, but you can only make big changes on a few things at a time. I
Mm,
subscribe to the two rivet rule.
mm.
Um, Back when the Golden Gate Bridge was built in 1930s, they effectively said if you replace more than two rivets at a time, you will compromise the entire structure.
Oh,
So they
interesting.
would only address two rivets at a time, but they would fix the entire bridge, but two rivets at a time. And I do the same thing. I only have two major initiatives per year. We may be doing a bunch of other things, but there's only two that I'm reporting up to the board, two that I'm reporting up to my executives, two that I say, I need your support on these things. Right. And they have an appetite for two. Right. And so that's kind of how I approach it. Because I completely agree with you. If you start giving like, here are 10 major initiatives, then nothing's a priority at that point.
Well, exactly, right? And like if you look at the definition of priority, it's like the one thing. And it's always funny to me how we all have like so many different priorities. But I think it was Charlie Munger who said something along the lines of like, why we're going to prioritize things that we're never actually going to do, right? I'm paraphrasing there. But that's the thing is, and it's funny. I had somebody on my team who joined, and we use OKRs. I love them because it really kind of
Mhm.
helps make things crystal clear on what you're working on. And I give a lot of latitude for my teams. Like this is what's important for me. Like these are the non-negotiables, right? Like the 1 to 2 projects, we have to do these, right?
Yep.
But maybe that's going to be 50% of your time. So what is the other 50% of your time going to be beyond just the business as usual stuff, right? And so they'll put together a list and come up with it. And the first time I remember, I got the first list of projects that they wanted to work on in one of the quarters, and I said, "There's a lot here." And he's like, "Yeah, I think I can get through it all." Though I was like, "Okay, well, like, what's the order?" Right? And puts it together. And of course, we get to the end of the quarter and we got through maybe like 40% of that, right? It's
Right.
like, all right, so what did we learn? Well, you know what? I was probably over ambitious there. So next quarter, I'm going to pull it down, right? And so those are the things where I could go in and be like, no, no, don't do that. You got to do it this way, blah, 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 right? But like you have to live through some of these things. And as long as you're creating the environment for your teams where they can fail safely, that's the stuff that matters. But like those 1 to 2 priorities that you called out, and I love the 2 rivet rule, by the way. I'm stealing so many things from you today. I'll definitely attribute it to you. But this is something where like you have to focus down on the things that matter, and don't lose sight of those. And then there's other things there, like as you have time, get through them, and you always have your backlog, but like don't lose sight of the main thing, because another saying, right? The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing, like, and that's it.
Absolutely. I think that comes from a CISO's vision, right? And
Yep.
so you define the vision and strategy, and I am intent at least once a week they hear the vision. I like to say feel the windshield, right? I want them to always know what's in front of us. Every step we take should be moving towards that individual vision. Jason, awesome conversation. We will run this back. I assure you, I know a lot of people are going to benefit from this. Thank you for taking the time. We got to navigate politics, compliance, expectations, and this is the life of a CISO. At the end of the day, we're not in there turning bolts. We're not in there hammering nails. We're not in there programming firewalls. This is what we're dealing with. So anyone that wants to be a CISO, if this sounds like something you're interested in, you're on the right path. Thank you, and have a great day, man.
Thanks.